fifth annual Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel conference. We're thrilled to be able to have our students present their research. I think including this year, the fifth year, we'll have almost 60 students who will have presented their research, including those that are presenting today, from courses they're taking with our faculty, independent studies, theses, and most of our students happen to be Jewish studies minors, but some aren't and just happen to be in a class that counts for Jewish studies. And so we welcome everyone and look forward to a stimulating discussion. We're very proud of all of our students, and we are thrilled that you're here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentations. And Professor Bernstein will lead us off with the first panel for today.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great to see people participating and having students have this opportunity to present their original research, which is really quite impressive. Let me, without too much introduction, I just wanted to say that each presenter is asked to keep it to 15 minutes, just so we can have time for everybody to present and also for there to be some questions and discussion afterwards. And I would encourage anyone in the audience, please, to think about questions you might want to ask or points you want to raise with the presenters. We're starting, so we have three presentations today. Pelli Mechnikov is speaking on Becoming Israeli, Stories of Aliyah. Yael Eichhorn is talking about Tzniut and modern day Jewry, and Ben Francis will be speaking about graffiti in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And why don't we start off with Pelli?
Sounds good. Is it okay if I share my screen for my
Please. Is it all set up to do that?
No.
Ariana, are you able to? Do I need to grant position? Let's see.
And you might just mention, like, each of you what class. I know you've done yours with Professor Kedem, Pelli, because then it's nice he's here to hear your presentation as well.
Pelli, you now have permission to share your screen.
Thanks, Ariana.
Yeah. All right. Here we go. Okay. This is my presentation, Becoming Israeli, Stories of Aliyah, that I did as a part of my Hebrew independent study with Dr. Jewry Kedem. So before I begin, I want to lay out a couple important terms that are going to come up throughout this presentation. The first is Aliyah, meaning immigration to Israel in Hebrew. And the second is Oleh, plural being Olim, which means immigrant or immigrants to Israel in Hebrew. And I'm going to just use these interchangeably with their English throughout the presentation, so keep that in mind. It is known that many different communities of Olim are both stigmatized and stereotyped within Israel. Additionally, Israel is an extremely young country, so it's basically built by immigrants, which is why I think it's so ironic that so many Olim don't feel Israeli, let alone comfortable in their country. This is why I think it's important to explore the feelings surrounding Israeli identity of different communities within Israel, which I think can sort of open the door to how to better accommodate not just immigrants to Israel, but really immigrants to any country. The big question that I'm focusing on and that I focused on throughout my paper is the question of what causes an Oleh to feel Israeli or not. And this is what I'm going to be looking at throughout this presentation. So just think about that as I'm going through, if you have any thoughts. In order to understand the experience of Olim, it's extremely important to at least have a basic understanding of Israel's law of return. This is a document created by Israel's Knesset, so Israel's parliament, that establishes the limitations on immigration to Israel, as well as certain rights of inheritance for immigrants to Israel and their families. For my project, I conducted 5 interviews via Zoom. They were each 25 minutes to an hour long and were semi-structured, meaning I had a few questions that I asked throughout each of my interviews, but for the most part, it was just organic conversation. And all of my participants were given pseudonyms in order to protect their privacy. Here you can see a layout with some more information about all of my interviewees. Here are some of the topics I talked about throughout my paper. They ranged from the reasons the Olim made Aliyah all the way to differences in culture between their country of origin and Israel. The question that I'm going to be talking about throughout this presentation, because obviously I don't have time to talk about everything, is the question of, do you feel Israeli? And this kind of goes back to that big research question I was talking about earlier. And I had not originally planned on asking this question directly to my interviewees, as I thought it might be sort of insensitive or maybe uncomfortable to just ask someone whether they feel like they're Israeli in their country. But I was pretty surprised because it came up naturally in almost every single one of my interviews, which I think is super interesting. Now I'm going to talk about some of my findings in regards to this question. The first person I'm going to talk about is Warkanesh. She is currently 22 and immigrated from Ethiopia in 2006 to Israel. Warkanesh says that she feels very differently now in Israel than she did when she first arrived. She no longer has a problem with the language, and she doesn't have a problem learning with Israelis. And as we continue to discuss this topic, she ended up just exclaiming that she feels Israeli and as if she's like indeed a part of Israel. But then she spoke more generally on the topic and says that she thinks you can distinguish between many different groups of Olim and between people who do feel Israeli and people who don't. For example, she mentioned that adults probably feel less Israeli than children, she imagines. She says she thinks it's harder to distinguish between children who feel Israeli and children who don't. Maybe children who don't feel Israeli, she says, didn't get the same opportunities as children who do, and maybe were discriminated against. She says she's lucky, though, not to have had experiences like this. Moshe, who immigrated in 1990 from the US and is now in his 40s, says that he felt pretty much Israeli by the time he reached the army. He felt that Israel was his home, and it stayed like that for him for a long time after he returned to the United States, because he came back actually from Israel and moved back to the US. And he says that after being back in the US for a long time, Israel still felt more familiar to him. And the time that he actually became aware of being more Israeli was when he had actually returned to the US. He's quoted as saying, "I don't remember so much a feeling of being Israeli, so much as just a feeling of being comfortable where I was." Sarah is currently in her 50s and immigrated just in 2019 from the United States, to Israel. She says that she feels strongly like an Israeli citizen, and she thinks that this is largely due to the cultural diversity of Israel. Sarah lives in Ashdod, which is a city that contains many French immigrants, which definitely contributes to the cultural diversity that she experiences. Additionally, Sarah had come and lived in Israel earlier in the 2000s on student visa, so it's her second time living in Israel. So she thinks this also impacted her feelings. She also cited the government offices in Israel as something that positively impacted her feelings, which I thought was kind of funny. But yeah, she made that clear that that positively impacted her, which is interesting. Max immigrated in 1997 at the age of 25 from England to Israel. And he is different in the way that he says that he's constantly asking himself whether he feels Israeli or not. He says that something that really affects his feelings is his connection with Hebrew. And he says that when he speaks Hebrew, he feels like he becomes like a different person. In his mind, he thinks that English culture is like the opposite of Hebrew culture. So when he speaks Hebrew, he feels like he takes on this sort of Israeli character. To ground himself in Israeli society, he does things like volunteer on the Israeli police force. And he understands how Israeli society works, so much so that people are like calling him up personally to ask him questions about how things work in Israel. But despite this, he says that he doesn't totally feel Israeli. And when he returns to England, he doesn't totally feel English. So he's stuck in this sort of interesting middle ground. Lev is currently in his 40s and immigrated in 1989 from Russia at the age of 17. He cited a particular concert and song actually that connected him to Israel. Now I'm going to read a quote that he said during his interview, I think really explains what he means by this. So he says, "There's a concert that I came to several months after coming to Israel. I heard a singer singing one song, Somehow it got me in a way that I cannot explain. And there I really felt connected. There was no way to rationalize. I knew no one in the crowd. Everyone spoke another language. It was in the middle of the desert somewhere, but somehow it got me and I remember that feeling. So Lev also joined the army at the age of 21 and served for 23 years, which he says, you kind of have to form a strong connection to the country doing that. And that really connected him. So obviously we can't know for sure what made these Olim feel Israeli or not, but I think that their interviews can help paint a clearer picture. It was written about in an article by Karmit Safir Weitz for a news source called Ma'ariv in 2015 that the city of Haifa's initiative for New Olim helped create a large impact on the experiences of the Olim in Haifa. I imagine that the same concept may hold true for the people I interviewed and for Olim in general, in that the cities that they reside in when they first come to Israel may have a large impact on their experience. Additionally, it was obvious that language acquisition had a strong impact on some of the interviewees. Warkanesh, Moshe, and Lev did not know Hebrew before coming to Israel. They didn't find it to be much of an issue. Max, on the other hand, was significantly influenced by his connection with Hebrew. As I mentioned earlier, he feels as if Hebrew shifts his character, which I think points to a problem not with the language itself, rather with how language and culture sort of intertwine to influence his behavior and his attitude. I think this is important because in the end, it seemed to be something that deeply influenced him. He mentioned it a lot, and I imagine that it's likely something that impacts other people as well, not just Max. The factor that seemed to have the largest impact on whether the Olim felt legitimately Israeli or not seemed to be their reasons for making Aliyah. Warkanesh, Lev, and Sarah all seemed to have positive attitudes upon making Aliyah and felt passionately about their reasons for immigrating. Additionally, they each had a level of discomfort in their country of origin. For Warkanesh and Lev, it was needing to escape their country as refugees. And for Sarah, it was not feeling accepted in the United States for her religious expression as a convert. Max made Aliyah, however, for slightly different reasons. I imagine maybe he was less passionate about what Israel would provide him, and maybe this led to some of his differences in feelings from the other Olim. Something that surprised me throughout this research was the fact that the differences in culture between the countries of origin and Israel for these Olim wasn't actually a huge hurdle or issue for them. I expected this to be sort of the center point of our conversations, but it ended up being something that didn't strongly affect them other than Max in the way that culture affected his connection with the language. It's important to note some of the pretty significant limitations in this research, one being language barriers between me and some of the interviewees, as a couple of them spoke mostly Hebrew, and Hebrew's not my first language, so there were some difficulties with that. Additionally, the whole paper and research was originally conducted in Hebrew and had to all be translated into English, so that may have also led to some issues. Next, Lev's wife, Anna, during Lev's interview, made a statement about her own experience immigrating. She was called derogatory names by individuals in Israel, had an extremely difficult immigration experience, and notes that many other women who have made Aliyah from the Soviet Union have had similar experiences. She says that not everyone felt as accepted and quote unquote Israeli as her husband did, and that many people left positions of high social and financial status in order to immigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel. Obviously, most of the people I interviewed had rather positive experiences. This is an example of a more negative experience, which leads me to my next point. This group of Olim does not encapsulate the diverse group of immigrants and Olim that live in Israel, which obviously you can't get the full experience. They were largely from English-speaking countries, so they don't fully encapsulate that diversity. Something that I'd like to research further is the difference in experience between parents or older adults who immigrated and children and younger adults. Most of the people I interviewed were younger when they immigrated. I noted that it would be a very different experience, it seems, between adults and parents and children. Warkanesh and Lev both mentioned the different experience that their parents had. So this is something that I'd like to explore further, maybe by interviewing a more specific group of people. I think that this research is extremely important because despite being about the specific experiences of immigrating to Israel, I think this research has the ability to affect immigrants to any country. By better understanding what makes an immigrant feel at home and accepted in their country, this allows us to implement better infrastructure in order to better propagate a more positive immigration experience. So I would like to acknowledge Dr. Jewry for guiding me through this research. I genuinely could not have done it without him. He helped spearhead this project and provided me with resources and people in order to interview. So I could not thank him enough. I would also like to acknowledge all of the interviewees who donated their time. It's really hard to talk about something like this sometimes, especially with somebody you've never met before, because it's kind of a sensitive topic. So I would just like to acknowledge the fact that they all graciously told me their stories. And thank you guys for coming to my presentation. Here are my references.
That was really wonderful. Thank you, Pelli.
Thank you.
Let me, Yael, I should have clarified beforehand. Do we want to have the questions immediately after each talk, or do you want to wait till the end?
I leave it to you. Just because of time, it might be better to wait to the end so we don't get caught up, like, so that one person doesn't have more discussion on their paper than another. Maybe it's better to the end for that reason.
All right, then if I could ask people who have been listening and have questions, please write them down so you don't forget, because I want you to, you'll be hearing 2 more presentations before we get to the question and answer period. So, let me just we'll move on to our second talk. What did I do here? Sorry, there it is. Okay, so this is Yael Eichhorn is going to speak on Tzniut and modern day Jewry, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Okay, great. Let me just share my screen really quick. Okay, can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the title of my senior thesis is Tzniut and Modern Day Jewry. Okay. Okay, so Tzniut, or modesty, Tzniut is the Hebrew word for modesty, has traditionally been thought of as a code of conduct in dress, in behavior, and even in thought. So the concept of Tzniut is basically laws that have to do with modesty, both in dress and in behavior, like I said. In order to understand them, I decided to take a look at the original basis of these laws, referring back to biblical sources and the instructions within them, and then look at how they have been commonly interpreted. So one of the most well-known and traditional practices of Tzniut is for married women to cover their hair. And that primarily comes from this first source, which is a biblical source, explaining a ritual in which a woman is suspected of adultery by her husband, who had a warning issued against her being alone with other men. Her husband decides to make a claim against her in the Beit HaMikdash, or the temple, and the priest uncovers her hair for the ritual that proceeds, in which the woman has to drink a potion that will kill her if she is lying, and will bless her greatly if she's telling the truth. So next I have a Midrash Halakha, which is a biblical interpretation focusing on Jewish law and practice, and it refers to head covering as Torah law, even though it's clearly indirect within the Torah. However, it is said that a Torah level prohibition of a woman going out without her hair covered is inferred because in the ritual, the woman's hair is uncovered to disgrace her. Okay. So what does Tzniut mean? The 5 denominations and groups that I looked at were Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and unaffiliated. So that could be like post-denominational or independent congregations. And the only denomination that had a widespread information available was Orthodoxy. And the figure here shows a modern day Orthodox interpretation. So it has more general rules, like that the clothes can't be tight fitting, but there are also some extremely specific rules here, like that the back neckline has to cover the second top cervical bone, and sleeve length has to be at least 3 inches below the elbow. Okay. So here are some more examples of how Tzniut manifests within certain Orthodox communities. On the left is a page from an Orthodox newspaper called Mishpacha. It is of engagement announcements. As you can see, there are no women, and that is because this newspaper has a policy of not publishing pictures of women and their faces because it is considered immodest. So instead, the announcements are published with pictures of the grooms and their fathers-in-law. And then on the right is a column in the Circle magazine, so another religious magazine, where people write in questions or ask for advice from a rabbi. And a group of girls, my dog is being really loud. A group of girls asked why pictures of girls or women can't be published, even if they are dressed modestly. And the rabbi's answer doesn't actually answer them at all. He just says that women already have a role in the house. This group of girls says that they feel misrepresented, and that really stuck out to me because in today's society, there is a push for representation and diversity in the media. And these girls have absolutely zero because the media that they have access to doesn't show anyone besides Orthodox men and boys. Okay, so on the left is a screenshot from an Orthodox journalist's Twitter, and her son actually covered his face to dress up as a woman from a book. And this is very telling of how normalized it is for women to be erased in her community completely, because for this child to be a woman is to hide himself and not have a face. And then lastly, on the right, I have a public notice. So these are often published in like Williamsburg. And as you can see, they have ads and sometimes community announcements. So circled in Yiddish, it says, if you are unable to refrain from putting on makeup, please wear a mask when you do school pickup so that you do not serve as an obstacle. By obstacle, they mean obstacle to men. And this last source is important to highlight because of the severe repercussions and ostracization that women within these communities potentially face if they don't adhere to these strict social codes. Okay, so I utilized a mixed methods research approach by doing interviews as well as creating a survey. So I interviewed 10 rabbis for about an hour each, 2 from each denomination so that I could do some comparative analysis, because even if 2 rabbis belong to the same denomination and that denomination has stricter and more clear-cut guidelines, they both could interpret that differently, and therefore their communities would look completely different. So I asked them questions like, what does Tzniut mean? And do you talk about it at all through classes? And what does it look like with your organization? So also like socially. And then I also published a survey and had answers from over 115 Jewish women anonymously from all different denominations, and they were multiple choice and write-in. So an example of a multiple choice question was, how important is modesty in dress to you? And then 2 of the write-in questions were, is modesty important to you and how you conduct your day-to-day life? And if so, how? And modesty means, and then they would write in their personal definition. And the personal definitions and the write-ins where I actually learned a lot about it. Okay, so I have 2 survey graphs. On the left is the breakdown, the denominational breakdown of the women who responded to my survey. I got mostly responses from conservative and reform women, but also from the other groups as well. And then on the right is a really important graph because when I asked women how important modesty in dress is to them, I thought that it would be way more predictable, but as you can see, the answers are really mixed. So like Orthodox women didn't all answer one way, conservative women didn't all answer one way, and that could be for many different reasons. So for Orthodox women, if they answered somewhat important instead of very important, it doesn't necessarily mean that modesty isn't important to them, but maybe it isn't something that they specifically focus on every day because maybe they have been dressing that way or thinking this way their entire lives. Okay, so I noticed two common themes from the writing questions on the survey. The first one was humility, and these are in the personal definitions. So a few answers I got were not bragging verbally or physically, being humble about your gifts, and even if you are financially well off, you don't have to flaunt it. It's not about bragging about what you have. And then the second theme was giving space to others. And a few answers I got for that were taking a pause before speaking so that I can really listen to what others have to say, and then listen more than I speak. So I did get kind of contradictory interview and survey data because denominational rabbis have a much more clear-cut idea of their own definitions of tzniut, even if their specific denomination doesn't have strict guidelines. So they were more predictable, but the same cannot be said for the women. So basically, like I was saying before, it didn't matter what affiliation each woman had. It wouldn't necessarily tell me anything about how they think about modesty. So it wouldn't stop an Orthodox woman and a Reform woman from both seeing modesty as humility or both seeing it as dressing conservatively. And denomination is only one influencing factor upon how women define modesty. Yeah, thank you. I want to thank Dr. Yaros for being my advisor and also everyone for coming today.
Thank you so much, Yael. All right, our final speaker is Ben Francis, who'll be talking to us about graffiti in the Israeli-Palestinian context.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute my screen and do this all at the same time. So thank you so much for everyone for being here. I'm going to try to zoom through my presentation because initially this was I made this presentation to be 50 minutes. So we're going to try to zoom through it as fast as I can. So, just for a little bit of context and understanding of graffiti in general, I wanted to kind of put in place a few things first and kind of how I came to my presentation. So I did this project in regards to a senior seminar for my James Madison College major in arts and politics. And how I kind of found my understanding of it was through watching a video in our first class that really kind of made me interested in it by someone named John Berger. And so, a big part of it is like understanding the meaning and context of art in general. So I just wanted to play a quick clip from something that he made. Are you guys able to hear my?
Not yet.
Okay, 1 second. I have to get to it.
No, we're hearing.
Perfect.
That as soon as the meaning of a painting becomes transmittable, this meaning is liable to be manipulated and transformed. It's no longer a constant. It's changed by the camera which moves, by words put around it, by music played over it. Now, lastly, paintings can be changed in another way. When paintings are reproduced, they become a form of information, which is being continually transmitted. And so there, they have to hold their own against all the other information, which is jostling around them to appear on the same page or the same screen. The meaning of an image can be changed according to what you see beside it or what comes after it. Let's try a last experiment. We put the image of this well-known painting by Goya on your screen. You look at it in the context of what I'm saying, in the context of my image in relation to it. But supposing you had just turned onto this channel from one of the other two, then you might see something like this.
I'm sorry, it seems like I
Each
cut out.
time, the impact of the Goya
Can you guys still see my
I've
screen?
now emphasized the ways in which reproduction makes the
I'm not
meaning.
seeing the screen anymore.
Sorry about that. Okay, no worries. So, the biggest reason that, I really wanted to show that was, after watching this video,
You're freezing, Ben.
I don't know what is going on my end, but can everyone hear me and see me again? Okay, very good. I'm so sorry about that. Anywho, what I was saying was, after watching this video, it really made me have an understanding of, I guess, trying to put it in the context of graffiti. Graffiti kind of tells a story of self-expression that's based on situational placement that both, kind of pertains to geography, but also time period. And unlike many other art forms, the art usually forces an audience's attention by displaying art in public venues, which is often happens illegally. So, just kind of, I'm going to give a very quick context to graffiti, the histories of graffiti and its origins. So, just what graffiti is. Graffiti actually derives from the word graphia, which means scratches, and it actually predates written language in general and has been universally used throughout the world. We can see this through Egyptian hieroglyphs, Roman expressionists that I'm going to show later, and German propaganda. So very quickly, I'm going to go through some things. So within Pompeii, this is actually a political ad from 79 AD that was just in the streets of Pompeii. Another thing that I'm going to show is walls in the Hadrian Walls from the 3rd century in Rome, and this shows, we see this as vandalism, but back during this time, this is actually seen as a way of self-expression, and this was legal, and actually, even with the photo on the left, it was actually very much encouraged to self-express yourself. And then, a little bit darker of, what propaganda and, potentially graffiti can be as a way of spreading information and spreading a narrative in some way, shape, or form. This is showing where, Jews own businesses or own buildings and such during Nazi Germany. And then kind of moving from here, I'm going to be talking about, the history of modern graffiti before I talk more about how it kind of found its place in Israel. So firstly, I'm going to be talking about Bozo Texino. So he's the first, very well-known tagger. That's what, graffiti artists, that's kind of their signature. So a little bit of context of Bozo Texino. He's infamous for the cowboy face and has become a staple of vandalism on freight cars throughout the 1960s. The infamous cowboy with a pipe hat became known as one of the first tags in modern day graffiti. These tags act as a way of expressing the individual's existence in the world. Even with attempts to deface and erase such tags as Bozo Texino, these tags continue to pop up for decades. And then kind of moving from there and the progression of graffiti in general, we found people like Cornbread and Tacky 183. And that kind of happened with the development and creation of spray paint, first as Rust-Oleum. And at the time they didn't know, but Rust-Oleum is extremely toxic and more toxic than spray paint today. But through this time, in 1967, graffiti rose exponentially. And what kind of happened is, one of the most famous people, Cornbread, began his tags in the streets of Philadelphia, where he grew up. And, his biggest thing is we can see here is writing things like Cornbread the Legend, or Cornbread Philly, or Cornbread Loves Lucy. I think that was one of his most famous ones. And then just writing all over subways, Tacky 183, and things like that. And then moving over into graffiti stencils. So Black Lerat in, I believe, 1970s, came over to America and saw graffiti all throughout New York City when he was visiting. He was an art student and wanted to bring that back to Paris. But just because of French people's care for their country and for the beauty of their buildings and the history behind it, they're very patriotic people, making sure it looks pretty, and through that, wanting to stencil things. And so this is one of his most famous. He's very much well known for doing rats in general, and his reasonings for doing rats is, he's quoted saying, he really believed that rats were the only animals to survive the apocalypse, and quite possibly because a rat is an anagram for art. So I found that kind of funny in general. And then kind of going from there and how that kind of developed in Israel. So I really believe that the differentiator of people's appreciation for the city's history as well as its buildings in Paris is very different from in America, is just the care for the country and the patriotism in general. And a major reason that Black Lerat stenciled instead of tagged was because he felt it was more appropriate for the French architecture. I also believe that there's a sense of collective appreciation of the country's ingrained in culture compared to the anger within America found within these taggers. And many of them were lower class individuals from underrepresented communities. And playing with this into Israel, especially with some of its first graffiti artists, many just tried to create light out of some worse looking buildings or situations. So on one of the most famous is Rami Mary. So he is a famous graffiti artist throughout Israel and has been commissioned by the state, by different nonprofits, and his work is all over the world for his different graffiti art. On the left is part of a building that was destroyed by bombs, I believe in the 1980s. And his purpose of this was to kind of bring light to, a dark situation. And on the left, this is just, I'm pretty sure this is like a bomb shelter or something like that. And what he's trying to do with it is, just create art out of it and make it a lighter interpretation. But there are, even within that, some people within Israel that, did feel underrepresented within the Jewish community. And a lot of this came from Jewish immigrants coming in the 1990s. And like a group called Patrol 36, that was actually extremely well known for drawing swastikas in synagogues and high schools, because they themselves didn't feel Jewish in Israel, but kind of playing into Pelli's presentation, they didn't feel Jewish in Israel, but they didn't feel Israeli in Israel, but they didn't feel Russian in Russia. And that was a big issue within that. But then kind of going from there, talking about more modern day graffiti, Florentine is a working class community where I actually stayed for 2 months when I was doing research in Israel at Bar-Ilan University, and I really got exposed to graffiti in Israel, and that's kind of what really prompted me to do my presentation on this. So I'm actually going to show some pictures. So I actually don't want to incriminate myself, but I also did some graffiti as well and kind of learned from different street artists over there. This is my current girlfriend. And at the time we were very good friends. And yeah, this is a street art piece that I did with Muriel Cohen. She's a very well-known street artist in Israel. And this is just kind of, bringing light to a, worse off area in Tel Aviv in general. And then, just kind of looking at Florentine today, I wanted to show you guys what it kind of looks like. This will take about a minute. So much of it is, there's a lot of taggers and stuff like that, but also, throughout, there's some beautiful murals that we'll see. It's making me go to an ad, so I'm just going to show you guys pictures. So kind of going over, a lot of it has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How can there be peace when there is no trust? This is from Muriel Cohen. And, this one really resonated with me, but there's also ones that, also talk about peace in general. The bird of peace never knew he would have such a long journey, but also fun ones.
Upheaval in the drone industry as employee invents indestructible drone.
Sorry.
This drone can give you all
there we go. And then other ones, there's also people defacing other people's graffiti. So even Santa deserves a toy. Women are not toys. They're animals, mammals. And this is just people crossing over someone else's graffiti and someone else's graffiti. And, I didn't particularly like this, but what this kind of shows is graffiti can become anyone's art once it becomes public. And anyone can create a new meaning to it and add to it, which I found very fascinating. And then kind of moving from there, I'm going to talk about this within the Palestinian narrative and how graffiti is a way for Palestinians who feel extremely brought down by an occupation of Israel in general, especially within the West Bank, but also in Gaza. So I wanted to kind of look at some of that in general. So first I'm going to talk about Banksy in Gaza. Banksy is one of the most well-known graffiti artists in the world, and he actually has made multiple trips to the Palestinian Authority and Gaza to create art and bring awareness to the issues of Palestinians. So, as we can see, these are terribly destroyed and desecrated buildings, but he tries to, create light out of it, creating a kitty with a ball of yarn. And his reasoning specifically for this one was, people want to look at cute cats on the internet. Maybe they'll look at Gaza now. Other things in general, this show, I forgot the name of the Greek goddess, but this shows a Greek goddess mourning over the death of her children. And this very much alludes to the death of children of a Palestinian woman who lost her children in a bomb raiding. And then in general over here, as we can see, this is a watchtower, and this shows children, kind of going around in one of those circus amusement park rides, and just kind of playing to that in general, and seeing these children walking around, and then looking at the occupation wall that divides between certain parts of the West Bank, and looking at some of the beautiful stencil art and activism that can be seen there. I always found it extremely fascinating, and we can see how a lot of people feel in general within this area. Seeing specifically on the right side, pulling over the wall and seeing paradise. And what I kind of saw that as is, in destroying this wall, much like, the Berlin Wall, one day this wall will be destroyed, hopefully, or something like that, that we will see peace and that we will see beauty again. And then the walled off hotel, this is actually something that was created by Banksy, who I talked about earlier. He created this hotel with the intention to kind of show and bring hospitality and bring tourism to this area, and it's known as having the worst view in the entire world for a hotel, because your entire view is a wall, and you only in certain rooms only get an hour of sunlight a day directly into their rooms. And this shows each and every single room is completely different and designed by Banksy to talk about different issues within the Palestinian narrative. So here we can see surveillance cameras everywhere, other things like that. We can see a Israeli soldier fighting with pillows with a Palestinian activist, but they're fighting over pillows, showing how childish this is. This is very similar to what I showed previously. Over here, this is one of his most famous graffiti arts. Is it will be him holding a flower bouquet instead of a Molotov cocktail. And then quickly, I know I'm running on time, but I just wanted to quickly show you guys some things inside of this. It's going to take long, so I'll just continue on, I guess. And just showing different, beautiful thing, road to peace from this. And what this really showed me in general, and looking at this and also visiting Israel and the Palestinian Authority multiple times, is seeing that both sides do want peace, but it's finding that connection and both feeling trapped and both feeling scared from the other side, from either being bombed and who bombed who first, who hurt who first. And the biggest issue is both sides are tired and they want peace, but they don't know how to get to peace. And it's mostly the people, the layman of the society not knowing how to create peace within their society. And many of the people in governmental positions and in elite positions within their societies are the ones that are really dictating this war between these people. And so make hummus, not walls. I felt like this was really interesting, but also make hummus, make peace. That's something that I always found very interesting. And then specifically, this is actually on the wall dividing Gaza and Israel. In a past path to peace, I actually visited this multiple times, and each other, be neighbors in a very civil manner is, kind of what we're looking towards. I know I did go over time and I'm terribly sorry, but thank you so much for listening, and I greatly appreciate it. Any questions?
Thank you, everybody. Those were all wonderful. And I think for those of you who are participating, I think it's a great example of the work that our undergraduates do and their originality and creativity. And I also want to thank their faculty sponsors of their research for mentoring these students as well. I think we have about 20 something minutes. Let me, I have comments to make too, but I'd like to hear from other people perhaps first, and I can add my comments if we have time. So let me ask if there are any, if you can unmute yourself and pose any questions or comments you have to our presenters.
I have a quick questions for all three were excellent presentations, really, really impressive. So for you, Pelli, I was kind of curious, and of course this is outside of the scope of your paper, but just to get us to think through what your kind of initial reaction would be to kind of what's in a comparative manner in terms of immigrants to Israel versus immigrants to other countries like the US. Would you say from the research that you did that in some ways it's easier because it's such a young country and there's so many immigrants in Israel that, in some ways it's easier, in some ways it's harder, and that it's a young country and it was an intensification initially, especially for people to assimilate. So that's kind of one question I kind of had for you. And also I was really curious about, I forget whether his name was Moshe, someone who felt like his personality was a little different in Israel than it was in his home country. And I've talked about this recently with my sister too, because we grew up partially in Israel, and she was like, oh, when I speak in Hebrew, my voice is lower and my personality feels like a little different. And I almost feel like a slightly different person. And I do in some ways too. So I was really curious for you to elaborate on that. And then for the Tzniut, I thought you did an excellent job, Yael, and I thought that I kind of was interested in you elaborating on what the differences were among the women who were defining how important modesty was to them, what differences in your survey showed perhaps how they viewed modesty differently, or how they would define it. And then I was really interested in kind of one of your quotes was that some of the women were interpreting modesty as kind of listening more and speaking less. And I was just really curious whether you found this in certain groups versus others, especially like I always tell my students, like Madeleine Albright, who's the first female Secretary of State, always her last line of her book is young women should learn how to interrupt. So I'm just kind of curious, like what the multiple implications are of listening more and speaking less. And Ben, I loved your presentation, and I saw you were calling for some commonalities, which I really liked, and to look at Palestinian and Israeli graffiti, and one of which was showing buildings that are bombed or showing bomb shelters, showing the impact of the conflict, and kind of reinterpreting that or kind of trying to kind of rise up almost out of that and find something better or beautiful, and also in the desires for peace. What are some of the differences maybe you could expand on as well that I think also were brought up in some of those pictures?
Definitely. I mean, some of the differences I initially saw was, at least for Israel, they are definitely have a lot better footholding of the land in general. They have a more, they have a stronger government in general. They're more well recognized as a country. And because of that, you can definitely see a lot more positivity within their graffiti. You know, what I kind of showed is, a lot of it is just commonalities in their, daily life of, issues of standing in a line and the graffiti of that, or issues of women's rights or racial rights in general. And then, within the Palestinian, a lot of it has to do with their occupation. And a lot of it has to do with them being mistreated by the Israeli government. And so that you can definitely see. Yes, there are, things within the Israeli perspective that, has a lot to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because that is always around them. And there's not a day that goes by without an Israeli probably thinking about that. But also at the same time, there's probably not a second that goes by without a Palestinian living there that's not thinking about it.
I'd be happy to elaborate on the question that you brought up. I think something interesting about like the differences in regards to Israel and other countries, and I talked about this a little in my paper, is the fact that most people who are making Aliyah to Israel, I think like they're Jewish, right? So that's like, that plays a big role in it, is the like sort of religion aspect that you don't get in other countries. And I think that that can sort of make it both better in that you kind of have this community already when you come to a country, and worse in the way that people who are maybe like, like Ben actually brought this up in his presentation in regards to like the Russian immigrants who didn't feel like they were part of Judaism, can also make it worse in the way that if you don't feel completely connected to that community, you're coming into this sort of area where this community is forced on you. And I think that can be challenging for a lot of people. So I think that that's something that is a big difference in terms of immigration to Israel and other countries. In regards to the aspect of like, it was Max who was talking about his connection with the language. When he talked about that, it was like one of my favorite points. I don't know if you could tell, it was like one of my favorite things that came up in the interviews, because I also have heard about that. I have family that, like my mom lived in Israel for a period of time, and I have family that's, gone back and forth between countries. And I think that that's like an interesting idea, just like psychologically, why that happens. And I would definitely, that's something that I would love to continue to explore as well.
Yael, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. So basically, in terms of the survey, what was really interesting is that there wasn't like a clear-cut difference between the women from each denomination. So it really wouldn't tell me anything about their own definitions. And then in terms of the theme within the personal answer, oh no, okay. In terms of the theme of with the personal answers of giving space to others, I interpreted that not as like hiding away, but more so to not like brag as well, not put yourself out there and take away space from others, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. Would anybody else in the please, you're right.
I do have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did someone else get called on?
Ray was going to ask, and
No,
Kirsten,
that'd be great. I will talk later anyway in this conference. So
okay, so Kirsten,
thanks. No, it was following up with Yael on the modesty and the definition of modesty, and the interpretation of modesty as humility. Do you think that was a misunderstanding in the term modesty, or do you think it's their interpretation of what Tzniut is?
So I really think that it's their interpretation. I don't think it's necessarily a misunderstanding, because I think that that's how these women define it, rather than saying that maybe it's just about clothes or about behavior. For them, maybe being modest is to be humble in their attitudes and just focus on that more.
And
oh, sorry.
Just to follow up again, like just that I'm just surprised that non-Orthodox women even consider modesty as a value. And just, can you talk about that in terms of non-Orthodox women?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting as well. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this research, because you never know like what Jewish values are important to which like people from which denomination. And so I think it's really interesting because although modesty is important to more liberal denominations as well, like you mentioned in your previous question, it could mean something completely different to them, right? So for them, modesty could be really important, but that modesty could be being humble or like giving space to others. So.
Thanks so much. It was really thought-provoking.
Kirsten, there you are, sorry. Kirsten, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to say these were terrific papers. I was really, really impressed. So thank you so much. It was really great to be able to tune into them. So I have a question for everybody. So Pelli, I loved your research. I thought it was really, I loved the way that you got into talking to people. I just finished a whole bunch of oral histories myself, and Leah is here and she did as well. So I'm curious, whether you I'm curious whether people were uncomfortable, how you dealt with sort of ethical issues about people being uncomfortable about their words being used in research, and like how you, I'm sure you had an IRB, but how did they sort of perceive, how did they think about sort of how their words were going to be used and what you were going to be using them for, or did that not come up? Was that not something that concerned them? So that's something that I would want to ask you. And then Yael, I wanted to know what got you interested in the subject, and what did you expect to find? I think it's really interesting that this was the subject that you chose, and so I would like to hear more about why you chose this. I think you did a really great job in sort of designing the research, but I'm curious to know what you were looking for and why you got interested in it. And then Ben, this is like just completely, so much of the graffiti's in English. So who's the audience? Like, I'm really interested, like, who are the artists and who's the audience? I'm really interested in that. I mean, not the last image you showed us was Arabic and mostly Hebrew and then English, but a lot of the stuff you showed us was just English. So I'm really interested to know about that.
So I'd be happy to answer that question. So a lot of the people I interviewed were from like personal connections, which made it a little easier in terms of level of comfort, because it wasn't just like, I wasn't a complete alien to most of them. I obviously, like, I asked everybody, it was a long conversation in terms of like, are you comfortable with this? Are you okay? And there was like communication between them. I sent my project to them to make sure they were comfortable with the way I had quoted them. Also, I think the fact that I mostly did not have questions that were set in stone that they had to answer. Like every question I brought it up, but it wasn't something that they were obligated to answer, or if I could tell that it wasn't gonna like go over well in the conversation, I didn't even bring it up at all. So it was really up to them how much they wanted to share, which I think also impacted the presentation in that I probably got less negative feedback, just because people don't usually offer up really vulnerable, painful experiences when you're having a conversation like that. So that's also something to consider. But yeah, that's kind of how we went around it.
Thank you.
And okay, so what got me interested initially in modesty, because I also think it's interesting that I chose this, because I feel like I would have chosen something about like Israel, or like Hebrew or something, but I think it's what initially got me interested in this topic was like societal expectations. So it wasn't even being angry about them or being like women are treated like this or something like that. It was more so like it really is interesting to see how women dress and if they feel that they have to dress this way. And then it kind of like went from there.
Ben?
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how to best answer this. So in regards to Israel, the biggest reason I actually nitpicked specific ones that were English just for my audience members when I was doing this presentation, so I wouldn't have to translate for them. And as you already know, I'm okay at Hebrew. I'm not the best at Hebrew. So in regards to that, making sure that I didn't, mistranslate something or something like that. But it's really surprising, actually. A majority of the graffiti that is in words in Israel is in English, and the ones that aren't are usually murals, stencilized murals and stuff like that I've kind of showed previously. And the big reason for that, I think, is to just create some universality to it, and kind of have it be something that everyone can have a conversation with. English is one of the most spoken languages, especially for tourists that come to Israel in general. And so, I feel like that was a big reasoning, but also a lot of the graffiti artists, like for example, Muriel Cohen, she's from Canada. A lot of them happen to be from North America in general. A lot of these graffiti artists that have become well-known over the past 10 years, especially in Florentine, which is known as the graffiti capital of Israel. In regards to Palestinians and Palestinian activists, I would say a big reason is just to get their voice heard. From a universal context, and having people see these photos and see these pictures is just, and their murals in general is to show people outside of where they're in, specifically in America and in other English-speaking countries, the issues that are happening over there, and kind of creating a commentary for it. So,
thanks.
Jewry, did you want to? Thank you all. Jewry?
So since I talked at Pelli for a whole semester about this stuff, I won't ask her any questions. I'll just ask Yael and Ben. So there's a couple of things that came to mind. Actually, there's a commonality to both your projects. There's a beach in Tel Aviv called Chof Metzitzim. It had a graffiti art by Rami Meiri. They're showing people peeking into the women's showers, and that's a graffiti. That's from a film called Metzitzim that was made in that beach in the 1960s by Arik Einstein and Uri Zohar, and it's a very, very kind of old Israeli male perspective on relationships in Israel, and it's very degrading to women. And Rami Meiri drew this graffiti there, and then it's been by feminist group in Israel. It was defaced a couple of times. Eventually, he was forced to remove this. So that's kind of a story that ties both your projects together, I think. Yael, I don't know if you've looked at any issues in Israel with Tzniut, but there's another project that actually Pelli did a previous semester of Hadatta, talking about the entering more and more of orthodoxy into textbooks in Israel, into educational system in Israel. And there have been issues with girls in middle school told not to come in to school with shorts, for example, in a secular schools in Israel, not in the religious schools in Israel. So the discussion of Tzniut comes into this kind of a thing. And I was wondering if there was any discussion about this in your project here in America. The other question up to Yael is the question of, I think if we look at this from a feminist perspective, the idea of Tzniut is oppression, is oppressing women to an extent. Was that your perception of it when you went into the project, and has it changed? So that's the question that I have for you. And for Ben, the whole graffiti issue in Israel, I was really wondering, there's all kinds of graffiti. You looked at it from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I used to see in Tel Aviv graffiti that said, "Homeless, go home." Are there other social issues that are dealt with in graffiti in Israel, not only this kind of a Palestinian-Israeli conflict issue that you've seen or that you're interested in?
Okay, so it's interesting that you mentioned the middle school thing, because when I lived in Israel in middle school, I did not go to a religious school, and they did tell us not to wear shorts, and it's very hot, and people didn't listen, and they didn't make a big deal about it, so it wasn't like one of the really big publicized ones, but I have experienced that. And I did discuss schools in my paper a bit when talking with one of the rabbis, because in his school, there's an emphasis on that. And then regarding your question, did I think it was oppression initially going into it, oppression of women? I don't think so. I think I thought that maybe they felt like they really had to more, and I didn't give as much time to like personal definitions and thinking that it didn't necessarily have to be about how they dressed. But yeah, I don't think I had like a specific idea of it being oppression before.
Yes. And then in regards to mine, so I touched about this a little bit before in regards to when I said, Israelis think about the conflict, every minute, every hour, versus Palestinians think about this every second. In regards, so when I was saying that, in regards to the graffiti I've seen within Palestinian areas and within these different areas known for Palestinian activist graffiti, there isn't much outside of the occupation and their own issues in general. But what I found in Israel actually is there's a lot of different issues. There's women's rights, there's issues with immigration, with taking in refugees, with just daily issues within life. And in regards to the one by Rami Mary, on that beach, I actually did read into that quite a bit too. I wrote about it in my paper. And how, after many times of it being defaced, it was taken down, just through the changing of the times. But yeah, there is a lot of different things, in regards to nationalism, in regards to either being pro-Bibi or anti-Bibi or anything like that. Israelis seem to be very, very political animals in general. Some feel like they don't have much of a say either way. It's Bibi is going to win, especially in the results of these past 4 elections. But it's really interesting to see through this art the inner workings of Israeli society and within their daily life and in their minds. So. Oh, thank you, Ariana, for putting that.
I didn't see it. What is it?
She said in 2010, going vegetarian graffiti was really prevalent around Tel Aviv, writing meat is murder in Hebrew. And actually, what's really interesting about that, so talking about different communities in Israel, Tel Aviv specifically is known as one of the vegan capitals of the world. And there's a lot of different like companies that are trying to work towards, creating more vegan society around the world in general, but also within Tel Aviv in general. So that's really interesting as well. I've talked with some different startups who have kind of been trying to create a vegan currency over there, which is really fascinating to me. So,
Laura, please.
Yeah. So maybe this can serve as a final question, but I was really kind of struck by the way that in different ways, all of you looked at different media, different ways that people express and think about their Jewishness, right? From national identities to art to clothing and values and dispositions. And I'm wondering, maybe as a final reflection, if all of you might just say a sentence on what could people who are interested in the study of Jewish identities learn from your research and your data? If you could sort of think about that in kind of one phrase, what can we take away from your projects for those of us who think about the multiple and diverse ways that Jews do Jewish?
That's a really great question. I think that also a really hard question. I think that it's interesting to see through my research how Jewish identity can sort of intertwine with your national identity. And for some people, they're not religious at all, but for them, being Israeli is their sense of being Jewish. And I think that that's a big takeaway in terms of Jewish identity from my project.
I can go next. I think for me, it would be to not stereotype Jewish women based on their denomination, especially for other Jews like myself, that I had like preconceived ideas about these women, but just because they were Orthodox or Reform or Conservative, it doesn't say like everything about them.
So mine's a bit of more of a roundabout question. So I'm going to try to actually bring it back to peace negotiations within Israel and talking about that within my paper. But, even within our school, we've in the past week, as me and Pelli know quite well, we've had some issues with within our student government in regards to, what we define as anti-Semitism and stuff like that. And a lot of people feeling that, Israel and the entire country of Israel in general are oppressors. And, yes, without a question, the Israeli government has to a degree oppressed the Palestinian people and the Palestinian government. But I think that's extremely wrong to say that the Israeli society in general and the layman of Israel does not feels the same way about Palestinians. In the same way that all Palestinians, hate Jews or Israelis, sorry. But what's really interesting, what this graffiti showed me is there's a lot of want for peace on both sides, and there's a lot of desire to just live next to each other. In my own perspective, I in high school, I had, I still have a friend that's Palestinian, and we've had family dinners together and stuff like that, and just talking about his family living in Palestine, and before the creation of the state of Israel, how his family would have Israeli families over for dinner and stuff like that, and just the commonality and just perspective that was kind of shown through him that I didn't really understand before, that even before all of this conflict, people were just people. And with the politicization of this over the past 70 years, and the hardship on both sides, without a question, that it's really divided us. And it's showing through this art that there is a desire for some sort of peace, and figuring out how to get that is the biggest problem. And hopefully the elected officials in Israel can figure that out, hopefully in the near future, but we will see.
All right, wonderful, guys. Kol hakavod, as we say in Hebrew, or yishar koach, as we say in religious circles. Really a wonderful job, and the discussion has been fascinating. I have a bunch of comments, but I think I'll just send them to each of you individually, if that's okay. I really enjoyed, and thank you for sharing earlier. All the three presenters shared their presentations or papers with me earlier, so I had a chance to actually read the in-depth analysis, which was fascinating as well. So thank you very much. I think Yael, am I correct? We're reconvening at 10:15. We'll have a short break.
Yeah, so please, for those of you who can, thank you, excellent presentations. Thank you. I know Professor Bernstein read all the papers and has comments for you, so thanks for doing that. Thanks for coming this morning at the end of a tiring week. And please, I'm just going to turn my camera off and be back in 15 minutes. So hopefully all of you who can return, please just turn your cameras off and then turn it back on.
This is our second panel of our conference today, and it's on oral history and American Jewish experiences. And I'm really excited because I have two of my students although Leah is presenting on a different topic, but still one of my students, so I'm very proud. And I've been working with Josh all semester on his project also. So he will be presenting, I guess we'll just go in order first, on Joshua Montgomery-Patt, and he'll be presenting on Skokie Jews, experiences surrounding the 1977 attempted Nazi march. And then we'll have Leah Welch presenting on Like a Snapshot of a Bigger Picture, Oral History and the Role of the Individual. And I will say, I'm Amy Simon. I think I know everybody here, but for the recording, endowed chair in Holocaust Studies and European Jewish History. And so although this is on American experience around the Holocaust, I teach with oral testimony. So I'm very excited to hear these presentations. Shall we start with Josh?
Thank you. So I'm Josh. I'm a senior studying social relations and policy and communications, and where I've lived since I was 2. And for those who don't know, Skokie is one of the northern suburbs of Chicago, and it is one of the one of the largest Jewish communities just in the country historically, still has a very large Jewish population. And growing up, I had heard about the Nazi March and how the controversy surrounding it was a large part of my community's history. And it's probably what we're most well known for across the country. Didn't know much about it, the basics that the Nazis had tried to march in Skokie, that they were represented by the ACLU. In doing so, the case went to the Supreme Court. And I became curious as to what it was like to be on the ground and be a Jew in Skokie at the time, after one of my friends whose dad had grown up in Skokie told me a story about how his dad and his dad's friends had gotten together with baseball bats to wait for the Nazis to come into Skokie, and that they were ready to defend themselves with violence if need be. And I felt like I was learning something new about my community, and I decided that I wanted to learn more by talking to Jews who lived in Skokie at the time about their experiences. And so as far as the background for the march goes, the controversy over the attempted neo-Nazi march in Skokie, and it was started by the attempt of Frank Allen, the leader of a small neo-Nazi group called the National Socialist Party of America, to secure the right to march in Chicago, where he was based. And his group had been marching in Chicago and preaching a message of racism against Chicago's Black crackdown on this by requiring them to post a large insurance bond to be able to march in the city parks, which Frank Collin responded to by reaching out to the suburbs to find alternative locations where he could protest his free speech being shut down by the city. And most of the suburbs ignored him, but Skokie vehemently responded with a similar requirement to the one in Chicago, and with an attempt to get him from being able to march there, which attracted his attention and made him decide that he would march in May 7, I believe it was. And just that, despite some original plans to ignore this, the community response from the large number of Holocaust